welcome to VCARA's Virtual Worlds versus Virtual Reality Smackdown. Our first presenter, Alyse Dunavant-Jones, argues that VR is the future, and the future is now. Our second presenter, Bethany Winslow, cautions that regardless of what VR platforms are used in the future, designers of effective immersive learning with virtual reality must know the history of virtual worlds in education, as well as have some hands-on experience in using them. The sparring partners will be moderated by Dr. Valerie Hill, the director of the Community Virtual Library in Second Life, Avacon, and Kitely. Alyse Dunavant-Jones, independent digital curation asset management consultant, is also a passionate virtual worlds librarian, including VR worlds. She holds office hours at CVL's main branch in Second Life on Tuesdays and at CVL's Sansar branch on Mondays, both at 12 p.m. SLT. Bethany Winslow is an instructional designer at San Jose State University. Bethany supports faculty integrating technology with their teaching and curriculum, including the use of virtual worlds in education. Bethany is a volunteer with the Community Virtual Library and the project lead for Hypergrid. Dr. Valerie Hill is director of Community Virtual Library in Second Life, Avacon, and Kitely. She received her PhD in Library and Information Science in 2012. She served as a school librarian for 20 years and taught language arts and information literacy at all grade levels from kindergarten through college. Val is currently an information literacy consultant with a research focus on the intersection of information literacy and libraries with virtual worlds and digital culture, and a professor at Peninsula College. And now I'll get out of the ring and turn the mic over to Val.
All right, I hope you can hear me all right. We're ready to begin, and Alyse is going to be speaking from the virtual reality perspective, this perspective of headsets. Bethany will be participating and speaking from the perspective of virtual worlds. Now, each one of our debate participants will have 5 minutes to respond to the questions that I will ask. And we're going to begin with Alyse. So, point 1 is on the topic of persistence in virtual reality. So, Alyse, when educators invest in a virtual world, 3D or VR, they want to know that their time and their money will not just disappear in a year or two, along with all of their hard work. So, are virtual reality worlds, VR, today, are they persistent enough for educators to invest in them?
That is an excellent question. So, persistence is always kind of tricky, especially when it comes to the long term of anything digital. VR platforms aren't any different. This would be especially because the medium is still developing and evolving, which means that there's not a single standard or preferred environment for education yet. It is somewhat of a gamble to put all of your resources into a single VR platform at this time. And you won't necessarily, if you do that, you won't necessarily be guaranteed that it's going to exist for 5 to 10 years from now, at least as it does today. However, because many VR platforms are in beta, meaning that they're in an advanced user testing phase, it's a great time to be involved in VR because developers of the new worlds are much more likely uh, they're much more likely to work with us so that they can meet our educational requirements and make VR worlds more relevant to us. So we're at a really pivotal point right now in making these worlds more persistent for us and having more features. A lot of the VR platforms are free to access right now. And so, like I said, now's a good time. It means you'll require fewer to no monetary resources from your administration to get started in a VR world. And my recommendation in choosing a VR world with persistence in mind would be to look into worlds that are associated with larger persisting companies. So Old Space VR is a great example because it's owned by Microsoft, and Sansar is owned by Linden Lab, the same as Second Life is. But most importantly, you're going to want to make sure that you document and save any crucial builds or experiences that you create in VR worlds. That way you'll be able to recreate them if you need to. And that is also a best practice for 3D virtual worlds, not just for VR. And then finally, I highly recommend that people familiarize themselves with the differences between 3D and virtual worlds. And just make sure that when you use a VR world, that you're using its unique advantages to the fullest extent. And I've linked to a Hypergrid Business article that talks a little bit about those differences. You don't have to look at them right now, but that might be helpful for folks in the future. And it'll also help justify the use of a VR world over a 3D world to your administration. If they are really, really valuing persistence, that might help give you the best argument possible for getting involved there.
Thank you, Alyse, especially for that link. And now to Bethany. Bethany, what about 3D virtual worlds? Are they more persistent than today's VR worlds?
Well, again, I think that's a really great question. And one of my first thoughts in response to Alyse is how would you save the worlds or sims built on these different beta platforms? Why can we assume that everything would be exportable? I'm not sure that that's something that we can just assume. Uh-oh, is there a dragon above me?
Yes, there is.
Oh no. But I think it's worth mentioning, as Alyse did, that most VR platforms, they are in beta. So I think it really clearly remains to be how VR fares in this department when we talk about which one emerges to dominate the market. And not all platforms offer places. For example, Engage, which is promoted education, lets you enter the same room, but it's not the same thing at all as a persistent space. So the objects you res there will not be in the new session. But persistence is one of the biggest reasons that virtual is popular from a decade. And even though Second Life doesn't have the same number it once did, the people who have remained seem pretty dedicated. I'm not the only one who loves OpenSim but can't bring themselves to leave Second Life, primarily because of what we've built here. We those or replicate them elsewhere real easily, but we've invested a lot here. That speaks a lot to the fact and the value of persistence. And what that persistence has enabled is a community develop, be that around common interests like, pirate and mermaid role play or educators wanting to meet. That's the real power of virtual worlds, how it has supported the development of so many different tribes of people. You look at the categories list on Second Life just to give you an insight into but this persistency has allowed things to evolve dynamically and organically. For example, who would have ever even predicted a subculture of tinies? These kinds of things wouldn't have evolved if they didn't happen in persistent virtual worlds where participants built upon each other's work and ideas. And cultures and communities are organic and evolving things. They can't be created by a single person, nor can they be created by a single company, a single game, or a single standalone immersive experience. Culture and community both needs persistence and time in order to develop. And the fact of the matter is, it's virtual worlds that have been bringing a wide range of people together, letting a huge range of creative things happen, and they've stewed long enough to develop a rich flavor. VR is like the new kid on the block. It's like candy. It certainly has some exciting potential with literally dozens of different platforms with all their different participants separated out from each other. There's just no there yet. And even if there were, there certainly has not been enough time and cross-pollination, anything meaningful to have developed yet. So, you know, the reason that this is so important right now is because we're talking about the educational uses of these technologies. And there's a lot of hype and a lot of interest among educators about VR, but I think designing effective immersive experiences will require familiarity with technologies that are going to, but it assumes a fundamental knowledge of the long history of immersive learning and education, like Second Life and Open. Educators who have no experience are going to be really at an increased, but I think tinkering with other educators is possible right now because of the persistence. I think that this is a great opportunity for experiential preparation. I think the opportunity to network and collaborate with a broad community of like-minded peers far beyond our own little. The fact is that this is happening already for more than a decade. That speaks volumes about the persistence factor. I know I'm certainly in this. I've attended a lot of remote conferences, happen every year, but I have never made a educator or librarian beyond the chat window of a live stream presentation. Never. But meeting the people I have at the OpenSim Community Conference, Virtual Worlds Best Practices, other CVL and VCARA events, the persistence of these virtual events and the environments we have here, the long history we have, this is what has both allowed and inspired me to invest my time. So I have some references I'll just post in here for anybody who's interested. And I'm impervious to dragonfire, I'm just saying.
Wow, Bethany just put in some major blows on the topic of persistence. And it made me think about the importance of persistence as it relates to networking and collaboration in real time. We're going to move on to point number 2, which is accessibility right now. So this time we're going to start once again with Bethany. And Bethany, another major concern for educators is accessibility. We want to make sure that our students can get into these worlds, regardless of their financial status, their disabilities, or their operating systems. How accessible are virtual worlds today?
Another really great question. Oops, I want to make sure you can hear me speak. Oh, there we go. I can't see I'm in a tiny, I can't see myself speaking. Everybody is really excited about VR and social VR platforms like Horizon. Facebook just announced at that Oculus Developer Conference. But everywhere I go, people talk about what we'll be able to do, when the truth is social virtual reality has been a long time in the making. And the technology we already have still has a lot to offer us right now. And like I've said, a lot of VR platforms are in beta, and in testing the desktop versions, I've found multiple sessions in several platforms where I've gotten booted out and I've had to log back in, or the controls to navigate are buggy. Don't get me wrong, I'm excited to see how they evolve, but in terms of usability and access to a wide range of users right now, they're just not ready for prime time yet. For wide use in education, we need technology that's more reliable. I work to support faculty to leverage technology of all kinds with their teams. I see firsthand how they won't use something if it's glitchy. In my experience, the best people to pilot VR will be people who had the most experience in virtual worlds, and those are people who are adventurous and adaptable enough for it. But let's get real. VR is not really ready for prime time right now. Are you kidding me? It's totally not something we can just plug and play into the curriculum right now. Those of us here in world are the ones who are excited about it, but I'm talking about real world adoption by educators I know who are genuinely excited about the possibilities, and I just don't think it's realistic. Adoption is further out than we want to admit. Now, that's just talking about the ordinary accessibility to the kind of educators that I know, not really in terms of accommodating people that might have disabilities. But, in addressing that, I'm thinking of the people that were highlighted in Draxter's documentary. You probably saw our digital selves, my avatar is me, and how well it illustrates that virtual worlds support access to global communities, ability to diverse people. And another example is, a virtual ability here in Second Life, which has hosted events. They've been doing this since 2007. Virtual worlds already provide access to learning and socializing far beyond the isolated silos of our institution. So physical, location limits, that's no longer an issue. And it's more than that, just that it's provided for somebody with physical limitations that makes them homebound, or it's more than it's just that there's a viewer for people with visual limitations. It's more than the fact that the use of both voice and chat are commonplace in our culture here in virtual worlds. Accessibility is more than the notion of helping people who need accommodations. They're accessible to anyone without any special equipment needed at all. Virtual worlds don't require anything more than a laptop with a decent graphics card and reliable high-speed internet. Now, granted, that doesn't mean it's 100% accessible to people in third world countries, but it's far more accessible to learning for those people in those countries now than VR is. But even beyond that, researchers have also found that virtual worlds are accessible in the sense that they provide a sense of place, collaborative co-presence, and that's what has facilitated the development of those learning communities, the communities of practice that we have in world. Research has shown us that virtual worlds are an effective way for educators who might never have the opportunity to travel to conferences, be able to build and share their knowledge, and that virtual worlds increase access for rural and disadvantaged populations. Research has also shown that virtual worlds can support the development of skills in empathy and reflection, and that they provide opportunities to express more nuanced representations of self. All of these are benefits which are accessible to us now, and they're also needed for global civic engagement. And I think we can all agree the world we live in today and the world of the future has a lot of challenges for us. So it's essential we crowdsource our knowledge. We have to collaborate beyond our own little physical communities. And it's virtual worlds, not virtual reality, that is the proof technology that we can use right now. I could go on about global climate change. The UN is calling for a 45% reduction of greenhouse gases over the next decade. And so it's more important than ever that maybe we take this moment of hype for VR and use it for the greater good by promoting virtual worlds as the most immediately accessible and proven option to access to collaborative community. So one final point about accessibility I want to make. I was at the Academic Technology Expo last week. It's a yearly event, and different Bay Area universities gather and we compare notes on what we're doing with technology in our schools. And some of you might know, stopped by my booth. I'd heard his name before because I know he teaches for iSchool, and I think he actually helped set this island up here. His name is Jeremy Kemp, and he's very knowledgeable about virtual worlds and teaching. Anyways, he and I were chatting, and he remarked about how everyone was super excited about the headsets. And he said to me, where are the studies that show how long you can be in VR? Do you think any of these people have even thought of that yet? Now, we know people can spend all night in world on a computer. We've been decades, and we have lots of research. How many unbroken hours have people spent in VR? So I concurred with him, and I shared something that I remembered Kevin Feenan presented on, and I think it was at the 10-year VCARA event. Kevin talked about Gartner's hype cycle. He said those of us in virtual worlds were very familiar with that cycle because we've already gone through the trough of disillusion. Well, I agree with Jeremy's concern that VR is still in its infancy and some of its biggest proponents don't even aware of their own blinders. The research just isn't there yet on things like how long we can even VR or who might not tolerate it well. VR is clearly early in the hype cycle and it will go through that trough of disillusion. So again, we're just not there yet.
Okay, thank you, Bethany, on the topic of accessibility in virtual worlds and VR. And so, Alyse, on that same topic of accessibility, what about VR worlds? Would you say they are as easy to access today as the virtual worlds that Bethany mentioned?
Just let me shrink back down for a moment so that I can speak more easily. Give me one second. Okay, so to speak to accessibility, I will mention that headsets are a big issue with VR, as Bethany was mentioning, and they are becoming more and more affordable, and they're becoming more mainstream. I do have to admit that they're not as mainstream or affordable yet for mass access. Um, but a lot of the VR platforms also offer desktop VR, which means that you can introduce faculty and students to VR worlds without having to use headsets. So whilst the headsets do add an extra layer of immersion, you can still kind of get involved without having to have that technology and without worrying about the side effects of it. But just basically, it's the lack of a headset wouldn't be an obstacle for getting into those worlds. Additionally, schools and libraries are beginning to purchase VR headsets. I made her mad to be shared among users, which means that many individuals have access to a headset, even if they can't acquire one of their own. So just because you don't have one at home doesn't mean that you can't do anything with it. On the topic of compatibility, there are VR worlds that work with both Mac and Windows operating systems, and that's been a really big one. I know as VCARA has done some research. Sansar and AltSpace VR are both examples of that. And AltSpace VR even now operates on the Oculus Quest, and that means that you can access that world without a computer at all, which kind of opens up to a whole new series of gamers.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to point 3. Is that right, Alyse?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, for our point 3, we're going to discuss open educational resources and non-proprietary software. So thank you for that, Alyse. We're going to continue with you. Educators are known for fostering an open atmosphere when it comes to sharing knowledge and technologies. Are there any virtual reality open educational resources or non-proprietary standards or platforms out there?
Sure. The answer to that is yes, at least to some extent. So there are open source VR platforms today. The biggest one that I can think of is High Fidelity. Firestorm Viewer, which is an open source virtual world viewer, also has a VR headset option for OpenSim. And I've put a link in the chat to a really great Hypergrid business article that came out recently about the Firestorm Viewer and its supporting of VR. It is still in beta, but there are OpenSim users with compatible headsets that are using the viewer successfully today. And as I mentioned earlier, because many VR platforms are still emerging and in beta, we have the opportunity to work with creators and developers on the creation of open educational resources that fit our needs. In the case of existing platforms, High Fidelity and Kitely are really good examples where we know the creators and the developers. They're involved and they're happy to answer people's questions. So if you contact them with a request for a specific tool, they'll get back to you because it's not some massive company. It's people that are just actively developing it that are willing to listen to you. And another thing that's worth mentioning is OSVR. And it is a movement founded to create a universal open source VR ecosystem for technologies across different brands and companies. And it's very similar to what we need for education. It's predominantly for gaming, but it shows that there are great strides being made in creating open source content for VR. And then it is backed by major companies like HP and Intel. So those would be some really big factors in just kind of giving us that info on the open source world, I guess, in VR.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Alyse, for that. Speaking of open educational resources, so Bethany, where do virtual worlds stand regarding open educational resources and other non-proprietary software?
Well, you'll get no complaint from me about Alyse's mention of Kitely as a VR platform. I think it does sound like a good crossover platform, but most of the development in VR is being done by big companies. Judging from what I heard listening at the Oculus Developer Conference in San Francisco, my big takeaway was about how giddy everyone was about how much product was flying off the shelf. It was all about how much money and would be made. And I'm not kidding when I talk about the sense of giddiness. It was palpable. I used to be in sales and marketing, so I know trade show hype when I see it. And it did kind of depress me. I'm excited about the technology, yes, but I couldn't help but think about how education has bill of goods on the latest techno gizmo. And I see this VR moment as poised to be a big again, I could see this at that local conference that I went to last week, the AT Expo. I had a demo of the Hypergrid Resources Library and Kitely up for people to see. And I was talking about how important it is for educators interested in teaching with VR to be aware of the history of virtual worlds beforehand, because honestly, most people I've met have no knowledge of what we've been doing in here. So talk about being rude, glitzy, whiz-bang sales pitches, and it's only a matter of time before we see jumping on the bandwagon of whatever device and platform is pulling ahead of the pack. We're going to see initiatives to get them in every kid's backpack, just like iPads and Chromebooks or any other numbers of miracle technologies that came forward to promise to solve us every problem we have in education. But educators need to be at the center of creating the solutions, not just being the consumer of those solutions. And so there's this sort of demand for, I think, a really high level of digital literacy that's snowballing in urgency, this need for educators to be content creators as well as content finders and curators. And unfortunately, this takes more time than buying what promises to be a quick. But in the persistent virtual worlds we've had for a long time, there is a mature culture of making and tinkering, creating things that are these amazing builds and simulations. And much of it is widely available for anyone to visit or bring their students. Open sim worlds are a great example of an organic, democratic, decentralized digital maker where people learn by doing, by teaching others. Build, modify, and share objects. We can build on a small scale or all the way up to world building on an enormous. Open sim in particular, we have a real opportunity to actually crowdsource knowledge, to truly collaborate well beyond our institution departments. Imagine if we did create worlds and simulations and shared them via Creative Commons so that others could tweak and build upon them. Imagine if the community library could be a GitHub repository where that kind of sharing and collaboration was. I think that would be amazing. But even if we didn't go that route, people who enable hypergridding on their region, that we can take or send our students there on quests, just like we send them out to the library or a museum, physical world. I found an amazing replica of the universe, a model built by Palacky University in the Czech Republic, and it's wide open for anyone to visit. We need to leverage our different skills and expertise and collaborate globally, not just pay developers to build our little simulations that stay in our own little class, our own little department, or our own institution. The future of the world is open. Think about this culture of openness all around us. That culture that fostered the idea of investing in public libraries in the old days. That's the same culture that has brought us Wikipedia, the open source movement, Creative Commons licensing, and even the Netflix show Diagnosis is a great example of the power of sharing information. In that show, a doctor who's a medical journalist shows what can be done when a rare, hard to diagnose medical disease is crowdsourced to gather clues to help solve a really wicked riddle. And this is the model of the future. This is the model of OpenSim, decentralized and connected like the internet itself. Imagine for a moment, you guys, if we didn't have the internet, if we still had AOL. I know some of you are as old as I am and remember AOL. Imagine little closed worlds, each with their own little collection of websites or news organizations. Who here is old enough to remember the very first time you abandoned your AOL account and actually got out into the open internet? I certainly remember that. That's what we risk losing if we don't stay committed to open source, open educational resources, and stay with virtual worlds like OpenSim.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. I think that's really important. Content creation and the ability to import our resources is absolutely important, essential to educators and librarians. So we're going to move on to our point number 4, which is community of practice. And Bethany, will continue with you. What about community of practice? How robust are the educational communities and networks in virtual worlds?
Well, I've already spoken a bit about this when I talked about accessibility and persistence. But again, I think this is where virtual worlds really shine. VR doesn't have a community of practice yet. There hasn't been enough time for it to develop. Sure, there are social VR platforms with meetings and events, but there's a lot of chatter with those educators in VR on Discord, but that can hardly be considered a community of practice. I know that interest peaked a decade ago for virtual worlds, and many educators have moved on, but the community that has consolidated here in Second Life is really robust and is practice. And in terms of education, the community of practice that has remained here has matured and developed relevant expertise about the values of virtual worlds. And CVL and VCARA are just two of organizations that can speak to the development of this community practice. Organizations have had the time and the cross-pollination that has resulted in this. In fact, Pat Franks has a chapter in environments that addresses this specifically. The chapter describes how the community practice evolved organically over time. It was not planned, it emerged. And I want to mention too about the culture of virtual worlds because I think it's a critical element. I call this Burning Man in cyberspace, and I think the social aspect is the most likely to be overlooked by educators, but virtual environments have a unique culture that takes time and practice to acclimate to. Learning in the physical world has never taken place in a vacuum. It's situated culturally, historically, socioeconomically. Researchers have talked about the cultures and the tight-knit communities that have arisen in Second Life because of the affordances in virtual worlds. And I think there are subtle affordances we haven't even scratched the surface of yet in terms of the possibilities of educational value. Think role play writ large. I think there are aspects of embodying a virtual self that are not entirely understood without spending the time tinkering in virtual worlds. We don't know how to leverage these for learning. We have to be involved in that community of practice to get the benefits of experiencing something for ourselves and hearing from others what they've tried or what their ideas are. For example, one of the affordances of a virtual environment is how we represent ourselves. Would there be any benefit to not representing ourselves in human form? Under what circumstance might be useful to be in an animal or a different gender or racial identity? And what are the possibilities when we encounter, you know, this kind of physical self? So this community of practice is really critical right now because too many educators are excited about teaching with VR. And there are too many educators who are interested in VR, but who have never actually spent any time in a virtual environment. Uh-oh, I hear that dragon.
Excellent points, and that dragon is really making me feel like the hype of VR, and
Yes.
kind of illustrating your point, Bethany, of how you can utilize an avatar to express what the content that you're desiring to express. I'm sort of intimidated a bit by this dragon, as I am with the headsets.
Yeah, I think these things that we're playing around with, it's worthwhile to experience them before we can start thinking about the usefulness of them educationally. We have to be willing to play around with it a little bit.
Wonderful. So thank you, Bethany. And now, Alyse, you've mentioned that VR is still developing in many ways. Does it have a community of practice yet?
Actually, especially with the smack that Bethany's been talking, you might think the answer. you might be thinking the answer is no, and that it is all just hype. But actually, in my adventures in VR, I've actually found that to be not quite true. There's a surprising amount of folks that are interested in VR and are actively doing things in it. So despite its newness, there are already communities of practice, which I think says a lot about a medium. And these are people, it's not easy to be involved in VR right now necessarily, especially the folks that were even earlier than us in adopting it. And they're there and they're working hard and they're very passionate about it. So Alt Space VR is the best example that I know of. There's a large group of educators. They call themselves educators in VR, and they meet monthly in Alt Space. They're from all over the world. And they share their efforts, their interests. What are they doing in their classroom? What new platforms are they working on or have they visited recently? Talking about a lot of the big issues like bullying in VR. Because of the additional immersion factor of the headset, it actually can be even worse to be bullied in VR than it is in a virtual world. So there are a lot of problems that they're tackling that aren't necessarily something that they can learn from virtual worlds. So that's something that's been very important. And that group not only meets in world, but they have a Discord channel and a Facebook group where they're able to meet and talk with people. So even if folks can't get into alt space for some reason, but are interested, they're able to meet with them and share that practice that they're having. And then High Fidelity and Sansar have the benefit of creators that are familiar with Second Life and OpenSim. And so this is where the people creating these platforms aren't just people that have no idea what's going on. And I know Bethany touched on this a little bit where we do have people like VCARA and the Community Virtual Library branching out and looking into virtual worlds. Into virtual reality worlds. And they're able to kind of take that experience with them and look at things both ways. But we do have High Fidelity based on OpenSim, and Sansar is developed by Linden Lab, and there are a lot of people that were once highly involved in places like Second Life or OpenSim that have completely migrated. They've taken what they've learned in these spaces, and they've felt that going to somewhere with a headset is just that much more immersive and that much more effective. And again, there's a lot of passion there. So there's a lot of overlap among educational communities in VR and 3D virtual worlds. And Avicon is another great example of that. They're a huge organization that does a lot for the OpenSim Community Conference. And then I also mentioned VCARA and CVL earlier. So all of that is expanding VR's community of practice, not just folks that are brand new to it, but also folks that are coming in from 3D virtual worlds. And finally, we can't discount the gaming industry. I know it's very easy to dismiss as educators, but that's a huge community of practice, not just gamers, but people developing the game. And we don't always think of gaming, like especially when you have so many games like zombie shooting, for example. We don't think about that as being compatible with education. We think about gamifying education, but that's very different from talking to people who are developing and playing games from an educator's standpoint. But those communities are very passionate gamers, game developers, and they're what drives the technology forward. It's not necessarily educators. So some of that hype at the beginning needs to be there, otherwise it never bleeds over into education. And their end goals might not always be the same as us, but it's worth engaging in conversations with those developers and players because they're imagining new heights and uses for technologies that will ultimately benefit education. So they are also part of our community.
Excellent. Thank you, Alyse. We're going to move now to point 5, building independently and collaboratively. And so my final question for you both centers on building. In VCARA's survey, educators in both VR and virtual worlds emphasized the importance of building, both independently and collaboratively as a class. Is this possible in VR? Alyse, you want to go first?
Yes, sure thing. This is one of the more interesting topics that I have been researching because, as you said, it's such an important aspect that came out of VCARA's survey. I don't know if everyone knows about that survey, but VCARA conducted a survey among educators who are interested in VR. And we basically asked people what were the top priorities that they would need in order to teach in a VR world. Very much so based on experiences we've had in virtual worlds, as well as people who've never been in a virtual world. And being able to build was one that we thought maybe wouldn't be as high of a priority, but in the survey anyway, it returned quite a bit of folks that thought that it was a big priority. Now, for VR worlds, it is a little bit tricky. That would be because a lot of VR environments were built in specialized game engines. That would be Unity 3D and Unreal Engine. Those are both available for free, but they do have a bit of a learning curve for non-computer scientists. So if you're not much of a coder, you might not be as interested. Though, to be 100% fair, if you're interested in learning how to code, I've heard that Unity is one of the better platforms to learn to do it on because you're creating something fun. So there's kind of that. I do have a link to something called MakeScene. It's a 2016 article that lists some free software tools for exactly that sort of thing. And so I thought that was kind of fun. So if anybody is interested in playing around, those are some good tools. And that includes Blender, which is used a lot in Second Life as well among artists and designers. A lot of developers expect that their users are going to develop content using the same software that they used, rather than using the VR platform itself. That's just a bit of a cultural thing that's come about, that it's not a huge priority among VR platforms. There are some exceptions. The biggest one would be that you have platforms like Sansar, AltSpace VR, Engage, and High Fidelity, which have ways that you can design in world. And that would mean that developers, people who are really familiar with working with things like Unity, are creating just extensive lists of pre-built objects. Trees, houses, animals. I actually found a pre-built castle that serves as CVL's library in Sansar. It didn't take me very long to put it down. I didn't have to build it from scratch, but it looks awesome. And you're not necessarily creating the objects from scratch in world, but you can manipulate them, you can place them to design a unique environment. And that's what a lot of educators need when they're looking at creating an environment for their students. It's also similar to a lot of builders in Second Life and OpenSim these days. We tend to acquire pre-built items from shops and the marketplace rather than building them from scratch anyway. And in fact, there has been several arguments that I've heard both in VCARA meetings as well as through people that come through CVL that building with prims in Second Life and OpenSim is becoming a little bit outdated. If you're trying to really design something that's eye-catching to students today, the blocky nature of the objects compared to more elaborate mesh pieces is really severely lacking. So folks creating the more up-to-date objects in Second Life, like this boxing ring, there's a lot of really cool things that you see these days, and they're using Unity. They're using Blender. They're not building with prims in Second Life. It's possible that the future of building from scratch for virtual worlds, and that would include virtual reality worlds, will require game engine software. It's very possible that it will kind of go out of vogue to be building in world, and you'll be using that other tool. So that said, while a lot of users can design / build independently in a lot of the VR worlds I've been to, as well as in game engine separately and then import their creations, there aren't as many robust options for collaborative building. But there are some products out there that make it possible. A Unity team is one that allows people to collaborate in a group. It's not so different from using Google Docs. Its free option only allows for up to 3 people. So that would mean that a teacher would need to split students into groups of 3 before collaborative building. But I personally don't think that that's that big of a deal when you're talking about people building and collaborating together. More than 3 people at a time, just from personal experience, is a bit much to try to supervise anyway, especially if they're all building something that's going to go together. It's supposed to be a collaborative sculpture or something like that. And a really big thought to close with would be to remember what I said before. Educators can work with the developers. These people are developing VR worlds, and so if you value something like collaborative building, and that is something that came up in VCARA's survey, and similarly with building in world from scratch, if you really want to be able to build with prims instead of importing the prettier Blender mesh objects, now's the time to speak up. We can speak up to these developers while they're still developing things before there's a big standard that's been established. And so that would be my piece. So yes, there is a way to do it.
Okay, thank you, Alyse. And now, Bethany, what about virtual worlds? How do virtual world educators incorporate building into their 3D classrooms?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to take exception to the idea that blocky prims are just not engaging, going forward. I think Minecraft is not pretty enough for me, but it's easy and kids love it, so I don't buy the idea that things have to be more and more realistic looking for them to be useful. And compared to having to learn multiple software, and we still don't know what was going to be the dominant tool of the future, we have tools that are relatively easy to use right now. And I can't think of a much better example than building independently and collaboratively with what we can do in virtual worlds than where I'm standing right now. This space has been here for 10 years, and most of you know probably far better than me how much it has evolved and grown, and how much that can be found here is from a wider community that has contributed to this space. You have presentations in the Archivium from people who are not from San Jose State or from VCARA or even from CVL. I was first drawn into Second Life from another instructional designer friend, but we quickly went our separate ways to explore the things that were important to us. We went right into meeting and fantasy role play and socializing, and I quickly bought land and wanted nothing more than to be alone, designing my space and practicing my decorating skills. While she and I would certainly chat a bit if we were in world at the same time, and I would see her in my physical world, the thing is that virtual worlds, by the very nature of them, as having been designed as purely user-created environments and not having any goal, that has been their greatest strength. Video and computer games, of course, are highly popular, and I can see a bright financial future in the world of VR gaming and how they'll contribute to education. But I'm also someone who thinks, you know, gamification is very promising as an instructional strategy in terms of how we design our learning. But I keep coming back to the fundamental strength of what virtual offer and the way in which they are very different than most of the VR I see so far. The VR I see at conferences and whatnot. And it's that Burning Man aspect. It's the physical world, you know, in the physical world, burners go out to the playa where there's absolutely nothing. There's not even any rocks or pebbles on the ground. All that can be found there is what you bring to it, your attitude, your creativity, your ideas, and your prejudices. Whatever it is that you bring, it will shape your experience. It's wildly freeing, nothingness. And I can't think of anything else that brings us to confront the reality of our existence, that our existence is meaningless except for what we ascribe to it. This is the essence of what it means to be an artist. Creativity coach Eric Meisel said that art is simply meaning. This is our highest and best self, you guys. We make meaning out of nothing but our own hands, our minds, and our raw intentions with our environments and social interactions. The passive approach of letting meaning be delivered to us, whether it's in holy books or in prefabricated and economically mediated experiences, this is something that is completely different. And virtual worlds are totally different when you strip those things away. I really worry that too many people, and educators I think in particular, may be prone to devalue those empty canvases. I worry about devaluing the essential messiness of creation. I worry about devaluing the sense of play and silliness that you find in places like Burning Man and in virtual worlds where the tinies might run amok. But tinkering and making culture is a wash in the same spirit. When I go to an arts collective, I see, hear it all around me. I went to Burning Man, I found it there. I came into Second Life and OpenSim, and even in the midst of very serious academic work, I find the same underpinning. But I worry that many won't honor this process, or are all too willing to sacrifice the inconvenience of the time and trouble authenticity and depth demands, and it'll get sacrificed to things that are shallow and expedient. I already know we have trouble getting people into here in virtual worlds because of the learning curve. It's just easier to be a passive consumer of pre-made content. And I really worry that the VR trend will continue to be driven by the entertainment industry and the gaming, which by its nature is passive. We are not encouraged to be active agents, and I don't care how immersive it is. Gamify learning and perhaps get students something fun that's evidence of their learning, but at what cost? I can imagine a lot of immersive learning experiences that are designed as a series of options, like a choose your own adventure story. And some might think that that's a good example of participant agency, but I suspect it does not demand enough from us. I think confronting the blank canvas and having to build out of nothing is bringing out our best. Virtual worlds are exactly the best evidence we have of the power of building alone and building in community. And I worry VR is going to cater to the well-worn comfort of our silos. It's our default nature to the known and the comfortable. But I think all of us here know intuitively, if not from our research, that pushing beyond that comfort zone is where we truly do the best work. So virtual worlds all the way.
Fascinating and great debate, Alyse and Bethany. VR is getting a lot of hype, but you have made us all think about the importance of including the history of virtual worlds in whatever decisions we make in the future. The ability to create, build, and import resources is essential for education in virtual spaces. Absolutely essential. So there are many differences and similarities between virtual worlds and VR, and there's something to be learned from both mediums. For educators to prosper now and in the future, we'll need more than a passing acquaintance with both. We need to get our hands dirty and consider and practice pedagogy and design within these worlds, and not just understand and experiment with hardware. We're going to let Pat close with questions and answers. I do want to mention, we talked about Discord being a great way to network, both in virtual worlds and in sort of exploring what's happening in VR. The Community Virtual Library will present a workshop on Discord here in Second Life on Sunday, October 20th. I'll drop you a note card. But now I'll turn it over to Pat to close with some Q&A.
Well, thank you, everyone. Our two combatants were fantastic, and our referee just kept us moving right along.